Victory to Everton and the cup.
Everton were finally good again. They'd got themselves an ambitious chairman in John Moores, a capable manager in Harry Catterick, and these were the glory years at Goodison Park. It had been a long old time since the goals of Tommy Lawton had taken Everton to their 5th championship in 1939, even longer still since the rampant days of Dixie Dean. When the Second World War halted organised football, it just about killed Everton. They returned to a limp after the war in an age of austerity, still cuddling on to the team that had won them their last success 6 years prior. Whilst others adapted, Everton struggled back into the bottom half of the table as the 1950s were upon us. A brief moment in the sunlight was quickly quashed in the spring of 1950 when they were beaten by their foes across town in an FA Cup semi-final. Gone was the chance for a springboard, a rejuvenation back into the upper echelons of the First Division. Here now was the fast-track demise back into the Second Division, confirmed by a 6-0 whitewash at Hillsborough on the final day of the 1950-51 campaign. The last time Everton fell through the trapdoor, they returned instantly. Then again, that was 1930 and Goodison Park still bore witness to Dixie Dean. Now under the management of Cliff Britton, it took until their 3rd attempt to return to the top flight, promoted as runners-up after a 4-0 triumph at Oldham. A return to the First Division didn't signal an automatic return to the heady days of the 20s and 30s. The goals of Dave Hickson and John Willie Parker dried up, Britton departed after 2 mediocre seasons in 1956, and his successor Ian Buchan couldn't cobble together much better, following up on 11th and 15th places with more of the same. Former Manchester United stalwart Johnny Carey was appointed in the early knock-ins of the 58-59 campaign and, for the first 2 seasons, wasn't able to drag Everton out of their funk. There was promising talent in Brians LeBone and Harris, as well as Derek Temple and Bobby Collins. The club seemed to be on the right track, at least. But then they went to the next level because of something from above that changed the entire club. John Moores joined the boardroom. The Pools magnate had been a millionaire since 1932, and after pouring money into the club, Everton told him he might as well just join the board. He found a club in the red to the tune of 50 grand, which of course he was able to turn around into an operating profit in the 1960-61 season. This came through ticket price rises and the slashing of matchday expenses. He was an ambitious chairman to say the least, attempting to acquire Frank Puskas at one point. And whilst obviously Everton never signed the great Hungarian, Moores had delivered the club an interest-free loan which acquired Alex Young from Hearts and Jimmy Gabriel from Dundee. Added to the recent acquisition of Blackburn's Roy Vernon, and you could whisper it quietly that the Toffees were starting to build a team. After dropping just 1 point from the final 7 matches, Everton finished 5th in 1961, a long way behind the great Bill Nicholson Tottenham Hotspur team. And yet, halfway through that unbeaten run, Moores showed his ruthless side, sacking Johnny Carey. On the eve of a 5-1 thrashing of Cardiff City, John Moores and Johnny Carey were embroiled in a long taxi ride conversation that ended in the Irishman's sacking. Harry Catterick was his successor. The new manager was a former player at Goodison Park, but ultimately was born into the wrong time and had to wait almost a decade for his senior debut owing to war. In his decade of managerial experience, he had already shown enough nous to say that Moores had ambition that extended to that appointment as well. After pottering around in the 3rd Division North with Crewe Alexandra and Rochdale, Catterick's big break came with the 2nd-tier Sheffield Wednesday. He returned the Owls to the top tier, had taken the club to a cup semi-final before launching a miraculous title bid in 1961 before he returned to Everton. The club weren't about to stop there. Billy Bingham was prized from Luton before Gordon West and Dennis Stevens' recruitment in the 1961-62 campaign. Whilst this kind of activity prompted the nickname the Mersey Millionaires, they had never gone into the market with a big splurge like Spurs' purchase of Jimmy Greaves or Manchester United's signing of Dennis Law. Everton's team did come to £300,000, which wasn't even the most in the league thanks to the money spent by Spurs. Meanwhile, Manchester United understandably needed to throw money around to rebuild after the Munich air disaster. And yet Catterick remained resolute in his beliefs money would be spent on experience as opposed to using the youth team that had reached the 1961 Youth Cup final. Also, he remained wedded to the WM tactic as Brazil tried their hardest to persuade English club teams the ways of the 4-2-4 after they had successfully retained the World Cup in 1962. Nonetheless, he'd inherited a team of defensive steel. Down the right, Dennis Stevens and Jimmy Gabriel combined, which left no room for Bobby Collins, who Catterick erroneously believed was over the hill. He'd moved to Leeds and was a driving force in their promotion. Down the left, Catterick would have problems with few real options until midway through the 1962-63 season when he acquired Tony Kay from Sheffield Wednesday. Whilst the Jekyll and Hyde nature of Everton was obvious in the 61-62 campaign, as they jumped from home victory against teams like Chelsea, they were left wanting on the road against top teams like Spurs in the league and Burnley in the FA Cup. Come the opening day of the 1962-63 season, Catterick's side would receive an immediate acid test when they travelled east to Turf Moor to meet a recent champion in Burnley. 10 minutes in, Everton a goal down there looked to have been a repeat of the limp cup performance of months prior, until Roy Vernon quickly equalised and the pair of Billy Bingham and Alex Young rang in second half goals. Second favourites for the title, Everton reaffirmed that status with a quick-fire double over Matt Busby's Manchester United and a 4-1 triumph over Sheffield Wednesday, which was wedged in between. That game saw the club debut of Johnny Morrissey, who had been poached from Liverpool across town. The Toffees remained perfect in front of their own fans at the start of September, sticking 3 beyond both Leyton Orient and Leicester City, but when they travelled away and pertinently down to the capital, they came unstuck. Dispatched by both Fulham and Orient, the latter of which who were now coached by former Blue Johnny Carey. Liverpool should have represented a chance for Everton to go top of the table again, but it was a frustrating draw, just like the ones felt at home to Villa and away at Main Road that plagued the Toffees' early stages of the season. Everton continued to take names though when they were on form. They put 4 goals beyond West Brom, smashed reigning champions Ipswich 3-1 and continued their goal-scoring streak at home to Blackpool and at Nottingham Forest. However, the best performance and result was reserved for when the BBC cameras turned up to Molineux to broadcast highlights from the top of the table clash between Wolves and Everton.
Morrissey with a cross, comes to Bingham, Bingham must score, and it's there. Beautiful body swear. Bernard, a lovely ball indeed through to Young. Young with a shot, it's a goal! Oh, a great goal!
7 points separated the pair going into mid-November, and even Spurs and Burnley trailed Harry Catterick's side. That was until Blackburn took the scalp of the Toffees. Nonetheless, Everton finished 1962 unbeaten, defeating Sheffield United whilst getting invaluable draws in tough places like White Hart Lane and Hillsborough before the Big Freeze decimated the fixture list. During the league postponements, Everton were able to get FA Cup games on at Barnsley and Swindon on precarious surfaces. Unlike in Europe, where the Toffees came unstuck against Dunfermline at the first hurdle, Everton did participate in the FA Cup come the spring, but were eliminated by West Ham. It quickly extinguished the double winning hopes of Everton. They returned slowly to league action after the elongated postponements, going down at Filbert Street before a worthwhile point was taken from Wolves' visit of Goodison Park. The ranks were bolstered by the signings of Tony Kay and Alex Scott upon the league's resumption, but it was Alex Young firing on all cylinders with the advent of March as he netted in wins against each of Forest, Ipswich and Man City. Whilst the Blues were third, 2 games in hand on both Spurs and Leicester left things very much in Everton hands in advance of Easter. Before they could get to the chocolate egg holiday, Everton returned to away woes against mid-table stragglers. First, Arsenal dispatched them 4-3 in a big help to their North London neighbours, while Sheffield United grabbed a late win 4 days later. The Toffees could no longer afford any further mistakes. They were 6 points back on league leaders Spurs with a couple of games in hand and a big red marker ringed around the date April 20th, Spurs' visit of Goodison Park. It was the only member of the top 5 that the Blues had left to play. Easter was usually a defining moment in any title race at this time, but before they could get there, a chance to make some ground up on Spurs. Everton had dispatched of Aston Villa comfortably before flaking out on 2 goalless draws against Blackburn and Liverpool, all the while Spurs went down at Hillsborough. Meanwhile, Leicester's 5 points from wins over Leyton Orient and Manchester City before a draw against Blackpool left them top of the table going into Easter, having played a game more. Everton were still third and would remain third, despite picking 5 points up from 3 games against Blackpool and Birmingham. Spurs' 7-2 thrashing of Liverpool kept them wedged in second as the pair were locked on 50 points apiece ahead of the London club's visit to Goodison. Given Leicester's draw at home to Wolves on April the 20th, whoever won the top of the table clash at Goodison would be joint top heading in to a crucial couple of days. A crucial couple of days where Leicester lost the FA Cup final and Spurs progressed through to the Cup Winners' Cup final. Whilst they were both busy doing that, Everton had got 5 more valuable points from 3 league fixtures. Leicester, with 4 away games remaining, would lose the lot, blinded by Wembley, ensuring they finished 4th in a 3-horse race. Meanwhile, Spurs would keep the heat on. They beat Sheffield United at home, just as Everton dispatched of Bolton by a single goal. The Blues led the league by 3 points, having played a game more than Spurs, and the permutations were simple: beat West Brom and Fulham and become champions. Scheduling prevented a final day showdown as Spurs wouldn't play before Everton's final game of the season, allowing 4 goals to be ran in at the Hawthorns and less pressure on their final match. Mid-table Fulham at home, 2 points stood between Everton and another championship. In the end, Everton demolished them. Within 8 minutes they were 2 up, and by the end of the afternoon the 4-1 win hadn't mattered much anyway, since Spurs packed in their title aspirations with a loss against Manchester City. Spurs might well have been the first English winners in European competition, but Everton were champions of England once again. Everton had gone to Europe's top table for the first time and they had been immediately turned away. What did it say about the Blues and English football in general if they were so simply swatted aside and shown to be so naive in the first round of the European Cup against Inter Milan? The year was still 1963, and whilst Helenio Herrera's Inter would become renowned as one of the finer teams in competition history, it said a lot that Harry Catterick was still willing to field a tactical system that had been undressed by the Hungarian national team at Wembley a full decade beforehand. That defeat and the rest of the mid-1960s was characterised by the manager's uncertainty of the midfield and the slow realisation that he had to alter something. He chopped and changed a lot in that area as Harris, Stevens and Harvey were all tried in Tony Kaye's role after he was convicted of fraud for being involved in throwing a 1962 match whilst at Sheffield Wednesday. Meanwhile, Alex Young took up the inside right position, which didn't suit him. Up top, Fred Pickering joined after Catterick had become disillusioned with his front line after their limp European exit the prior season. Pickering netted 37 goals from 51 appearances in the 64-65 season, and yet the Toffees were some way off the Manchester United pace and didn't particularly compete in Europe, going out to that same Manchester United team in the Fairs Cup. 1965 was finally the big sea change for Catterick and Everton. With 11 points to make up in the title race for the subsequent season, the manager couldn't ignore the necessity of changing systems for much longer. And he did change. Finally, the 4-2-4 was implemented. A return to fitness for Alex Young, this time as a strike partner for Pickering, might not have bore any fruit in an 11th place finish in the league or in the Fairs Cup, where Hungarians Ujpest comfortably beat the Toffees in the second round, but there would be glory in 1966 for the English team.
Sheffielders, team and supporters, it was the peak of excitement when David Ford scored Wednesday's second goal. Like Trabilko, he sprang it with a fine shot. Again, it was the 21-year-old Trabilko who scored to make it 2-0. That speedy left winger Derek Temple had a great chance and made no mistake.
Everton and Harry Catterick were imbued by the Cup triumph, just as the rest of the nation after the World Cup that summer. The Toffees still hadn't been shy in bringing players in through the door and could boast now World Cup winners Ray Wilson and Alan Ball. Catterick had even begun to trust the reserve teams. Jimmy Husband, John Hurst and Joe Royal were all beginning to be utilised. Topping up with other acquisitions, Mike Treblecock from Plymouth out of the front line and Howard Kendall out of the midfield, Catterick pivoted once again. The 4-3-3 was in, a holy trinity was forming in Kendall, Ball, Harvey, and Everton were slowly creeping back into the title conversation and were consistent in the FA Cup. The 6th of 1967 became 5th a year later before they were the third wheel in the title race behind champions Leeds and Liverpool in 1969. And even though Everton were a non-starter in the League Cup and upon their return to Europe against Real Zaragoza in the Cup Winners' Cup, the FA Cup meant solace and a date with Wembley in May 1968.
Hurst never far away from it. Fraser in. Albion piling the pressure on Everton now. This is Astle. Astle comes forward to receive the FA Challenge Cup from Princess Alexandra.
West Brom marginally victorious over Everton in the FA Cup final. It was silver again for the Toffees, but there was a distinct realisation that the Blues were back. Football was very different by the end of the 1960s. The maximum wage had long been abolished, which led to a long telegraphed removal of Alex Young from the squad after the 60s was blackened by the players' demands for higher wages. Either way, both his and fellow striker Fred Pickering's departure wouldn't be keenly felt thanks to Joe Royle's emergence from the reserves. It was another sea change by Catterick. He began to trust in his youth, from trusting none of the 1961 FA Youth Cup finalists to giving prominent roles to Jimmy Husband and John Hurst, who won the same competition 4 years later. The latest tactical shift had gotten the best out of Johnny Morrissey, who finally solved the club's left-sided problem ahead of the 1969-70 campaign. Behind him, the departure of Ray Wilson would be soothed by the mid-season acquisition of Keith Newton at left-back. Meanwhile, Brian LeBone's postponing of his retirement beyond a shock announcement in 1967 kept the defence sealed shut. And naturally implementing a midfield three allowed the holy trinity of Kendall, Harvey and Ball to work as a trio seamlessly as they all entered their peak. They were what you call the engine room, with all three able to tirelessly track back as well as attack. If the club had played their most attractive football in the first half of the 1968-69 season, they played their most successful football in the first half of the subsequent campaign. The Toffees were given one hell of a baptism into the season, facing Arsenal, Manchester United twice, Manchester City and Leeds United all in the space of the first 7 matches. They would drop just 1 point away at Main Road before finally a blip of a defeat away to Brian Clough's Derby County. A blip because Everton dropped only a further point from their next 10 matches afterwards. They were insatiable, only held at Sellers Park on October the 8th. From Joe Royle's hat-trick at home to Southampton to a 6-goal haul at home to Stoke, the Toffees could not be stopped. This was Harry Catterick at peak power, working under a 7-year contract and, after 2 changes of chairmanship, a new boss. He had complete control of the situation and his team looked all set to obliterate the points record set by Bill Nicholson's Spurs in 1962 and Don Revie's Leeds 7 years later. They led the league by a full 8 points after just 18 matches, and the subsequent wobble, defeats to West Brom and Liverpool with a draw at Stamford Bridge in between, was manageable and was only allowed thanks to a bit of an injury crisis at the club. With their lead whittled down at the top, Everton took to grinding out the festive fixtures, all won by 1-0 at Upton Park and at home to top sides in Derby and Man City. Topped by 3 points with a trip to Elland Road to come between Christmas and New Year, a win and the title race might just be over already.
Moribund Jones! A goal! Yes! Up goes Jones! A goal! Royal! Whittle! He scored! A good goal!
After another defeat at the Dell 3 weeks later, it appeared as though we had a title race on our hands once again. 1970 was opened with an early elimination from the FA Cup at the hands of Sheffield United. Now with just the league to focus on and the FA brainchild that the season must be wrapped up in mid-April, the campaigns of Leeds United and Everton took on very different angles. Leeds were on for a treble. They progressed past Swansea, Sutton, Mansfield and Swindon in the Cup in the first weeks of 1970 and welcomed the European Cup back with open arms in the first week of March. Everton meanwhile had 14 league matches and they went and drew 4 of their next 5 to make an already hotly tipped Leeds massive favourites. As Leeds prepared to jet off to Liège in the quarter-final of one competition and traipse down to the southern part of their county to meet Manchester United in the semis of another, Everton were 2 points off the pace with a game in hand. It was now a 2-horse race. Slowly but surely Everton got their players back and their form followed them. Joe Royle was back on the score sheet, Colin Harvey back into the squad after a mysterious eye condition, and Alan Ball returned after a 3-game ban for collecting far too many yellow cards. It's no coincidence that the Everton title machine spluttered back into life thereafter. Champions of the past were beaten in Burnley and Spurs twice, meanwhile Leeds had only made it into league action once in a draw to Liverpool. Their triumph over Standard Liège kept their schedule busy, as did their FA Cup semi-final with Manchester United. Their initial tie at Hillsborough had been drawn. 7 days later, a rarity as both title rivals took to the First Division field simultaneously. Both won, Leeds limply over Wolves and Everton more impressively over their Merseyside rivals Liverpool. It kept the Toffees at the top by 3 points, having played a game more. If there was a defining week, it was the one that built to Easter. In their semi-final replay, Leeds travelled down to Villa Park where yet another goalless 120 minutes played out. Therefore they had to go again 48 hours later in Bolton, where Billy Bremner finally ended the endurance test with the only goal at Burnden Park. With that finally settled, Easter came at the wrong time. Leeds chasing a treble in a season with its final month eradicated, facing 4 games in 6 days. They wouldn't win one. They lost to Southampton and Derby in the league over the holidays as Everton stuck 5 beyond Leeds' cup final opponents Chelsea on Good Friday. Then, just 4 points away from the title, Alan Whittle got an invaluable early winner for the Blues at the Victoria Ground against Stoke. It meant an April Fool's Day homecoming for the Toffees against West Brom. Meanwhile, Leeds were in European action at home to Celtic as they chased a European Cup final. In a match they had rested players for, they lost. Meanwhile, the double blow came from Merseyside. Everton had coasted to the title that Don Revie had long given up on winning. It was a successful time, overshadowed no matter which way you turned. In 1963 it was Tottenham Hotspur lauded for breaking down the boundaries when they became the first English team to win European honours, shortly after becoming the first 20th century team to win the English double. 7 years on, Everton were winning another championship when everyone was busy watching someone else, their title contenders, when they lost a European Cup semi-final at home to Celtic. Therefore, it's a legacy underneath the shadow of other stories. Nonetheless, the 1970s began in the best way for Everton. Harry Catterick had seemingly been able to get with the times, and in winning a second championship, they had done something the likes of Bill Nicholson, Bertie Mee and Joe Mercer wouldn't do. Don Revie hadn't equalled yet, and in doing so, he became the club's most successful league manager. Whilst Bill Shankly and Matt Busby were able to win more leagues and win for longer, Catterick was unable to delegate like they were. Busby was a tracksuit manager, Shankly the club manager, and Catterick wanted to do everything all at once. Especially by the mid-1970s, that was no longer feasible. As Catterick bemoaned the fact that he couldn't sign the players he wanted, across town Bill Shankly was cultivating a revolution based on players from the fringes, signing players from places like Scunthorpe, Bury and Bristol. The pressures of the modern game, combined with personally overseeing each and every scouting mission, saw to Catterick's early demise, not from the sport but almost from life itself. And whilst Catterick's falling out and subsequent shock sale of Alan Ball to Arsenal in 1971 hardly helped, the manager's deteriorating health started with their European Cup exit to Panathinaikos in 1971.
The Greeks opened the scoring in the first leg on Merseyside, an away goal that was to prove decisive. Although Everton equalised with the last kick of the game through their 19-year-old substitute David Johnson on his first European appearance, that goal was not enough. Everton could only draw 0-0 in Athens and went out on the away goals rule.
After suffering an infection in Athens, he'd be quickly hit with a heart attack months later. It was the beginning of the end, not only of the manager's tenure but the club's tenure as a top club. Billy Bingham tried and failed, Gordon Lee tried and failed. Like most footballing empires, Everton needed a few oscillations to get things right once again, and they would, but those are stories for another day. Most clubs would love a perfect boot room style scenario, as Liverpool commanded the English game more and more as the 70s and 80s wore on. Sometimes though it's not possible. To read about those times though, go check out our Liverpool series here.